Archetypes have been an important part of fighting games ever since they first gained a character select screen in Street Fighter 2. Even if you don't fully understand the idea of a Shoto, you probably know all about the more commonly discussed Grappler and Zoner. In the 30 plus years since Street Fighter 2, a lot has changed in fighting games, and way more archetypes have sprung up out the woodwork. In this series, I want to talk about the ones we don't really have strict definitions for, and pin down how they play, why you might play them, and most useful for you at home, how to play against them. In this episode, we'll be covering a fairly small archetype, but probably the most difficult archetype to deal with at a high level: the trap character. Trap characters do probably exactly what you assume they would do based on the name. They lay down traps that are either autonomous or have to be manually used on the opponent later in the match. This comes under a kind of set play, which is a broad term in fighting games that essentially refers to any scenario that has a setup and a payoff, which will most often be something to do with knockdown scenarios. But trap characters are dangerous because instead of requiring a knockdown for set play, although it can be very useful, their traps are entirely live in neutral as well. And while there are other characters with small examples of this, or even characters who have set play that acts very similarly to a trap character, perhaps enough to be considered one outright, I'm going to mostly stick to pure blood examples of this archetype and its strategy and counter strategy here. Characters who are made or broke by the presence of their traps and to whom their gameplay would entirely fall apart without them. Although this strategy will still apply to how you think about these moves in general, and you can technically think of this as one of the first move type archive videos, more of which to come in the near future. So firstly, there are two kinds of these traps. I'll call them triggered and passive. A lot of characters actually have the option of both, as in, they'll detonate on their own eventually, but they can be manually detonated early. This is often a must for their set play in that scenario, but I'm going to go very light on how to come up with your own set play scenarios in this video. If there's a lot of demand, I'll discuss that some other time, but instead I'm here to focus on general strategy. And the strategy for trap characters is to make sure that there are traps. This puts them somewhat in league with the likes of item throwers, where they play a lot of soft runaway, where they look to place their traps in relative safety. Normally, the ideal location, if there's an option, is slightly airborne, to catch approaches that are both in the air and on the ground, and more to one side of the screen than the other. And ideally, you want to keep the trap between you and your opponent, centering play as best as you can around the literal ticking time bomb. This, however, perhaps paradoxically, will also buy you opportunities to approach, as the trap makes counterattacking difficult and a lot of these guys have nasty and very safe high lows to enforce on the pressure that these traps create. Plus, given the most punishable and least safe time for you is while you're creating a trap, it sometimes can be a huge boon to your game plan to just fish for quick knockdowns without traps on screen at all, as the opponent will be looking for you setting them up in the first place, and then if you place them over your opponent while they're getting up, it'll put you at a huge advantage very quickly. For this, you want to have a very good handle of your game's movement and general safety. It tends to be the case that it's very hard for 99% of characters to punish something like a jump back air dash in neutral. But in attempting to do so, this can then make retaliatory jump forward dashes a very valuable and free air-to-air attack, which is much harder to do on reaction when you aren't purposefully setting up situations where it's a likely response. If you have the option, air grab is preferable when it's possible, due to the psychic damage reading the opponent causes and the free knockdown into trap setup that this offers. And essentially, you're just going to place a trap on top of this knockdown opponent for safety, and then go for what would most likely be two 50-50s in a row. Your opponent needing to guess your first high or low, the trap then activating and continuing block stun, and then you using the trap as a way to hide another mix-up from vision, which can be a high, a low, or a throw. And I'll be real, if you actually get the hit, comboing as these guys tends to be super complicated, perhaps to make up for how easy the actual pressure part is, since your highs are safe, your lows are safe, and you get a ton of forced guesses on every knockdown. It's generally then the case that you need to then put in a lot of work to optimize damage off of everything you do. So be warned, if you're interested in playing these guys, not only do you need to lab the set play, but some very long combos too, and then have good ideas on when and how to capitalize off of traps that are landing hits that you didn't cause to happen, like someone just air dashing into something that randomly goes off. You have to be quick on the draw, since the trap itself is just going to be negligible damage if you don't then put in the legwork to combo off of it. I can't really emphasize enough that you have to be hyper focused on your opponent's actions, because if they do something that puts them in danger, you want to be quick on the draw with a manual detonation, or be quick to capitalize on them getting caught by a stationary trap. The last part of playing these guys is properly understanding screen space, and where is valuable for a trap and why. A trap isn't going to do anything if your opponent is never in its radius, so it then becomes important to figure out ways to make intersection of your opponent and the trap as common as possible. And this is equally important whether your opponent's traps are passive traps or triggered ones. As a quick guide, directly on the space leading out of the corner is fantastic for passive traps, since the opponent cannot escape freely without doing an invincible reversal move, like a DP, and instead they will literally need to just accept your pressure and hold it. Whereas, for a triggered trap, it's better to just place it on the corner mark. If the corner isn't in play, I would use the rule of thirds to roughly divide the whole map. These intersections, whether you're on the retreat or aggressively pushing your opponent towards their half, you're going to see the most passing by on these third marks throughout the match, so it can be very positive for your play to specifically account for places that are important for your opponent to escape aggression, or for your opponent to attack you. So as a rule of thumb, if you're the aggressor, I would place the traps higher to prevent escape, whereas if you're defending, they can afford to be lower to guard against approach and force jump-ins. With that out of the way, we can also talk about the Herculean task that is dealing with these characters' nonsense on defense. Firstly, I don't want to say don't DP, but 75% of the time they're gonna really want you to DP, so they can then catch you on the way down for a bigger combo. So like 3/4 of the time, don't DP. Even when your body's urging you to do it, stay steadfast and just hold their pressure. And then you can do it when you've caught them off guard, and you know they haven't just safe jumped you, which, if you don't know, is a technique where a jumping attack intersects with you for only a couple frames, and the very next frame they're able to block. If you recognise they're doing a safe jump, never DP, but if they haven't done it, sometimes it's very good to mess their rhythm up. As a result of the weird way this form of pressure works though, waking up with a jab is sometimes also a surprisingly wonderful solution to this nightmare set play, because it's quite easy to fumble how airtight these gaps actually are, and if you manage to buy yourself space to leave the corner, the momentum will immediately swing fully in your favour, especially in an anime game, where you can quite likely very easily combo off of a jab starter. As for in neutral though, you want to remember this rule of thirds, but cut it horizontally rather than vertically. In anime games there's typically a super jump height which is much taller than a typical air dash, and typically just throwing in going over the traps sometimes, and mostly going under them, can really fluster your opponent, who really wants you to do something simple and silly like doing a jumping heavy attack while standing inside a lightning rod. And don't be afraid to think of the opponent like a regular character too, and ignoring the trap as an option when it's not in play, or if you're out of its range. For anime games, I have a regular rule which is block low by default, but look for highs, since characters are very unlikely to have grounded overheads that aren't within this fully reactable timeframe of 14 and over frames, and if you're specifically looking for high attacks and just letting all of the lows blur into each other, and ignoring all of that visual feedback, you can quite easily spot windows you have to mash out, or you can spot their turn naturally ending. At the end of the day, these block strings might be nauseating to sit through, but they are just noise when you're sitting through them, and they're surprisingly impotent when you actually look at how little of it is going to get past a simple low block. Obviously, this can leave you weak to throws, but you're entirely free to just look for that happening too, or occasionally just eat the throw. It's not like grabs do the most damage in these games regardless, and while that will reset the set play scenario, you're more than free to look for grab in future. In fact, having an iron defense is surprisingly easy against these guys. You just need to be very vigilant, patient, and diligent when you're defending, and that will very easily buy you gaps to turn the game in your favour again and become the aggressor, which essentially is your main goal. If you're not in a corner scenario and you're finding it very hard to approach, most of these games will have some kind of instant block feature, where you don't take any knockback or anything from blocking something, and you're then free to progress forward. Unfortunately, while the window for this is only a few frames, doing it is essentially necessary, which is what makes these guys a nightmare to play against at high level. Something you're going to need to do in neutral from time to time, if you're going to approach through a trap, is to just block while you're in its radius by doing something like a jump forward block, which is generally possible in these anime games that trap characters tend to feature within. It can be nearly impossible to approach if you're far too afraid of going past the trap, since that buys the opponent all of the screen space behind the trap on their half as their territory, and you just aren't interfacing with that whatsoever. So you're going to need to perform approaches, aggress, and push them back into their corner whenever possible. It's especially good if you can somehow manage to land a throw when they've cornered you, and then turn the corner situation on them. In a defensive scenario, they don't have any way to place their traps down, and given how necessary they are for their game plan, it makes these characters extremely weak and fragile in the corner, and normally they almost never have DPs, or any other kind of invincible reversal that doesn't require super meter. So while you might need to look out for that while you're pressuring them, most of the time you just get to dance on them when you've got them in the corner yourself, so it's really the scenario you want to be in, even if you're a pure-blooded zoner. You'll see this kind of smothering a lot in high level play when it's against trapped characters, and it's because it really turns their weaknesses on their head, and it prevents any of their strengths from coming into play. Characters like Testament, who are known to be essentially top 1, if not top 2 in Guilty Gear XX, are overwhelmingly strong because of the sheer amount of screen clutter that they can create besides their traps, which makes it nearly impossible to keep the trap fully in mind, and it makes you very weak to them. But it's very difficult to get these traps out when they're trapped in the corner and having to deal with your game plan, which hopefully you understand your character well enough to put into fruition. And so, swinging the momentum in your favour is really what you're going for against these guys, and trapping them in the corner to prevent them from trapping you really is the go-to strategy you're looking to implement every single time you end up facing off against them. And if you made it this far through the video, I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive on this extremely niche archetype and that you're excited to see more of both Archetype and Ability Archive in future. And once again, I'm gonna say I'm sorry for the wait. Researching these guys, finding great pro matches to show you all, and etc. extended this to be a very long ordeal that thankfully I should never have to repeat again, especially not for the next Archetype Archive, the One Shot. These guys are competitive powerhouses, and yet they're also pub stompers in spades, but they are significantly easier to explain precisely and eloquently to a much greater degree than trap characters are. If you enjoyed this video, it helps me immensely if you leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want more of a hand in the future creation of videos, not only can you comment anything that you'd like to see in future, and it has a chance to appear in polls for future archetypes and side videos that I cover, but you can even participate in said polls via YouTube membership down below in the description box or over on Patreon, where for as little as $3 a month you can gain access to polls, early access to videos before they're uploaded, or pay just $2 more for your name to appear in the credits, like this beautiful individual, my first student level supporter who personally picked the video you got to see today. Or even you could have a direct shout out of your name or some pseudonym that I'm allowed to say on YouTube as a disciple level supporter. That's going to be all for this video, but as always I just want to quickly leave you all by saying, stay safe.